Right, well, welcome to this kind of informal kind of Cockburn conversation about National Planning Framework 4. My name's Terry Leventhal, I'm Director of the Cockburn Association, kind of with me, and we've got a kind of a group of Cockburn members to have this really brief kind of chat kind of about it. And kind of with me is Andrew MacLeod, who's the Vice Chair of the Association and convenes the Policy and Development Committee, a public servant, a civil servant, an economist. He can bring us a really interesting perspective on that. And of course, many of you will know Professor Cliff Haig, our chair, who's Professor Emeritus of Spatial Planning at Heriot-Watt University, and has done a lot of work on MPF4 and has quite a bit to contribute. And for those interested, if you go visit our YouTube channel and look under the Edinburgh Civic Forum meetings, the meeting from the 1st of March, Cliff gave a really interesting presentation on MPF4, so you can go have a look at that separately. That'll be useful. And James Gerry, who's the Assistant Director of the Association, a town planner and environmental manager, he's done a lot of work with us in terms of kind of environmental management issues, looking forward, particularly in our COP26 conversation, which you can also see on our YouTube channel. So without any further ado, so we have MPF4, the closing date for consultation is the end of this month, 31st of March. Andrew, what are your kind of thoughts?
Thank you, Terry. Well, we've been doing a lot of work and thinking in the Cockburn Association about MPF4 and about what it means for Edinburgh. And obviously it's an important, as its name suggests, an important framework document that sets out the context and the background and guidelines for the way that planning decisions will be taken in the future. There are quite a lot of references to Edinburgh and specific points about Edinburgh in the document, one or two of which I'll touch on. But it's 8 years now since the last planning framework was produced, and the world in that time, the world has changed quite a lot. And obviously, in the circumstances and situation we're living in today, we know that a lot of things are changing very rapidly, and a lot of things that none of us ever expected to see are now happening. So what we're talking about is a planning framework that, for example, has to address the aftermath of COVID and what the effects COVID will have on our economy, what the lasting effects of COVID will be going forward. Much climate change and concern about climate change has been with us for a long time, but in the run-up and the wake of COP26 and the increasingly serious warnings coming from the kind of scientific community about climate change, that topic has become much more, and net zero strategy has become much more important, and all those are reflected in this document. So, I mean, I would say it has, in many ways, quite a different look from its predecessor, in the sense that a lot of what was the concern of the previous planning framework was promoting economic growth subject to constraints around kind of climate change and the kind of capacities of the economy and so on. But I think this document really moves on to put much more emphasis on creating a sustainable future, the sorts of changes in our cities that we will need to accommodate climate change, and what may happen, what the long run effects of the COVID pandemic may be. So there's, for example, talking about planning policy generally, it talks about the concept of the 20-minute neighbourhood, of the need for a different approach to kind of travel, car use, trying to kind of limit travel in the city. That's something that is reflected in Edinburgh in the kind of city centre transformation strategy that is designed to create a different pattern of movement around the city centre. There is also there's a question of where development should take place in the city. The Cockburn has campaigned for many years and objected to many developments that are going to extend the city and take up land into the greenbelt, and a number of these developments in recent years have been approved. And this document is much more restrictive. It's talking about more use of brownfield sites, a more sort of intensive approach to development in the city centre, again, around the theme of both trying to preserve the amenity and nature in the greenbelt areas, but also to create less need for travel, less need for movement, and to address some of the issues around about climate change and limiting emissions. The other area that I think is I say there are a number of references to Edinburgh in the document. Another area that I think is of particular significance is some of what is said about tourism. Tourism is a big issue in Edinburgh, and that there are a number of important references, I think, in the document to making sure that tourism in the future is sustainable, that it's consistent with communities. There are references to encouraging city centre living, which I think is very welcome in Edinburgh. Edinburgh is a city where we have a long tradition of people living in the centre of the city rather than just a city centre that is a shopping and kind of leisure place that people travel in and out of. That has come under a lot of pressure in recent years, both from new hotel developments that take up space and occupy buildings, and the expansion of short-term lets and Airbnb. And this document, I think, suggests that there should be some limits on those. So these are examples of some of the topics. These are key issues for our future as a city going forward. And I think what's important about NPF4 and the discussion around about NPF4 is that what we have been trying to do as the Cockburn is just to try and think about what is the shape of Edinburgh, what is Edinburgh going to look like 10 years ahead, 20 years ahead, because it's quite clear that there are going to have to be big changes in the way we use and develop the city, and that we need to try and move forward with that in a kind of we need a thoughtful approach, and we need to clearly, a lot will depend on the market and developers and proposals that come forward, but that needs to be in the context of a clear public framework and a clear and coherent approach to planning. And I think NPF4, I think there are many positive aspects in it that will help us to do that.
Great. Okay. Thank you, Andrew. James, your thoughts?
Well, I've concentrated on the draft policies within NPF, thought about how they particularly address the climate emergency, climate change mitigation, climate change adaptation. And so, yes, as we might expect, climate and adaptation mitigation is mentioned throughout the draft policies, and is perhaps, I would possibly say, prominent by its absence in other draft policies where we might have expected to see some reference. Policy 2 acknowledges particularly the climate emergency, which we can say is a positive thing. It is progress over previous policy frameworks, but even there, it's not really clear what priority planners, particularly planners considering individual planning applications, are meant to give to considerations of climate, and what weighting they have to give to climate priorities, whether it's in terms of emissions, whether it's in terms of adapting to a changing local climate, which in cities like Edinburgh it should be a significant consideration in the future. It's also clear from NPF4 that in certain circumstances, major developments that are high emitters of polluting emissions may be allowed. But there's no guidance to clarify what sort of developments, where might they be, what would we consider in the future significant emissions, levels of emissions, and in what circumstances, what specific and particular circumstances might such developments be allowed. So that needs to be clarified. I would suggest just too much leeway for local interpretation and local other local priorities to override national and international climate obligations. I'm also a bit concerned that the linkages between policy 2, the climate emergency policy, and other policies throughout the draft policy statement framework are not made. And so a very obvious example is the following policy 3, which covers biodiversity. And there's a very clear and obvious link between the current biodiversity crisis, which applies to Edinburgh and Scotland as much as anywhere else, and a changing local climate. You would have expected to see some linkage. There isn't a linkage. And then, given that there is a biodiversity crisis relating to climate change, for example, you might have expected to see a stronger language, a heavier obligation in terms of planning policy to protect existing biodiversity, and it's not there. Equally, another obvious place to look for linkages to the climate emergency, climate mitigation, and adaptation in particular, would be policy 6, which relates to design quality. And there we might have expected to see further clarification about issues such as embodied carbon, and when is embodied carbon and related issues of energy within existing but unused or buildings which are coming out of use, when are those issues going to be more important than simply demolishing buildings and building something new? Where's the balance between existing built heritage, existing built fabric within cities like Edinburgh? Where's the balance between preserving the existing built structures with their embodied carbon and demolishing and building a new, perhaps arguing that the new build will intrinsically be more climate ready and more energy efficient than an existing built structure could possibly be. There's also very loose language around blue-green infrastructure, which relates to, within a city context, issues such as the heat island effect and making Edinburgh and other cities more resilient in terms of a warming climate. Much of what's in the draft policy framework seems to relate to the urban fringe green belt issues, not to parks and green spaces within cities, which ironically are going to be more and more important in terms of helping cities cool in the summer and preserve a more stable climate in a more chaotic winter environment. And possibly for a city like Edinburgh, which is a coastal city, we so often forget, I think, that Edinburgh is a coastal city. Issues of coastal flooding will be and will be increasingly important to us. I'm not sure policy 13, which is about flood risk, really in the context of Edinburgh and in the context of Scotland's other coastal cities, really addresses the probably rapidly increasing risk of flood going forward. And I have to mention trees. Yes, there is support for new planting and promotion of afforestation, but there really isn't sufficient protection, I think, for mature woodland and mature forests. And of course, it's in a city like Edinburgh, it's the contribution of our mature trees, and which often at community level are highly valued. That contribution is so much more significant in terms of all aspects of climate change and many aspects of amenity than newly planted, large areas of newly planted trees. And the balance, I think, within NP3, I can't get that within the framework, and it just isn't quite there yet. It's heading in the right direction, but the emphasis in so many areas, environmental areas and in climate change areas, it isn't quite right.
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks, Scotty James. That's a really good analysis. And before I hand over to De Cliff, is my observations in reading through it. I think it was interesting kind of Andrew, you talked about an awful lot of the rhetoric with the kind of policy context is very interesting and in many ways kind of very, very encouraging in what it's actually kind of saying. But I think there is an issue that whilst the document is actually really quite strong on that kind of rhetoric or strategic policy statement, it seems to be a little bit kind of weak on the how you kind of get there and how you deliver it. So in kind of reflecting and thinking of kind of the pressures on Edinburgh, and although the plan doesn't really specifically talk about one part of Scotland kind of over another, is it seems when you get into the kind of guts of it underneath that there is an assumption that kind of Edinburgh will be required to take the shoulder of the significant economic growth, which will then benefit the rest of the country. Now, that may not be a bad thing at all, and that could be encouraging in a sense. But the expectations of what the city will need to take, I think, does have some concern. So just looking at some of the information in the appendices, where you're beginning to see the real implications of it. Kind of Edinburgh over the plan period, which is 10-year period, is expected to make housing land allocations to cater for something like 41,300 new houses. And that's within the City of Edinburgh Council area alone. The wider city region, including the kind of landward local authorities, that number increases to 75,300. By way of comparison, the City of Glasgow is only required to provide 21,300 houses. So Edinburgh is, over the National Planning Framework 4's period, is expected to kind of handle, not only within the city, double that of Glasgow, but the city region almost 4 times as much. And the plan talks about an infrastructure first approach, which we would support, about making sure that the facilities you need for effective living and for equality of life are there at the start of development. There doesn't seem to be little evidence when we consider that kind of urban expansion in terms of housing, most of which will be in kind of hinterland or edge of city kind of areas of that 75,000. And that kind of wider issue, the connectivity of infrastructure required to support sustainable transport, is weak. And is it achievable within the plan period in terms of a wider economic kind of framework? It's unclear. The plan also puts quite a bit of emphasis on particular housing products like build to rents, which, you know, having more affordable or more housing available for rent is a good thing. But the wider kind of economic markets as to how they deliver that, probably, I think, Cliff, as you've said in other kind of meetings, assumes that rents will be increasing ad infinitum to make it a viable or attractive proposition for investment to take place into it. And we know from looking at our casework activities through our Policy and Development Committee that the kind of cost margins for delivery of build-to-rent kind of properties is incredibly tight, which means the point I think James raised about the quality of spaces is put under pressure kind of immediately because of that. And I think finally, from a lot of the conversations that we've had, and where we think some of the emphasis needs to go into the kind of city, perhaps not surprisingly, NPF4 doesn't kind of address them. But we've talked so often about the need to change our kind of vision so that the maintenance and repair of existing places, of existing buildings, of existing green spaces is as much a national strategic project as building new houses or building a new railway or something. And I think that that's maybe that kind of paradigm shift that when you read through the document, some of the rhetoric is kind of encouraging, but there seems to be little support for actually making some of that kind of happen going forward. And of course, what I'll do is hand over to Cliff, who's probably the expert in kind of all of this, to really begin closing up kind of thoughts in this conversation on NPF4.
Yeah, thank you, Terry, and hello, everybody. Good intentions, as Andrew's explained, address the climate and nature crises, biodiversity crisis, look at community wealth building, look at circular economy, reduce travel times, transformation of social and economic relationships. All these things are in there. So plenty of good intentions to cheer. But those good intentions are then rather betrayed or undermined by a lack of real detail about how you actually do these things. And many planners, I think, will be challenged by how they translate the aspirations that are in NPF4 into day-to-day decisions. So there's an issue there about the detail, about the evidence base behind the proposals. And lastly, because I'm going to be quite brief, question about resources. The final section of the NPF4 is about delivery, but it largely repeats, describes the existing planning system, or the planning system that's in a kind of transition with new plans coming in under the 2019 Act. So there's reference to local place plans, there's reference to master plan consent areas, there's reference to regional spatial strategies. And we don't yet really know how any of those things are going to work out. But what you don't get is a clear picture of how each of these can connect back to those initial aspirations that we've talked of. And lastly, you think where planning system is at the moment, it's seriously under-resourced. I think that's now widely recognized. Enforcement has become drained of resources. And the real question is, if we're now going to be more ambitious, which I think we should be, more ambitious in dealing with things like embedded carbon, as James has said, then that's going to need more resources, more training, better attention to the detail, and a more confident set of decision makers in our local planning authorities. We can't do this transition to the kind of low carbon planning strategy that NPF4 wants to move us to. We can't do that transition on the cheap. I'm sorry about that, but that's the reality. In this gap between aspiration and reality, I think it's very important that community organizations have their say. It's a long read, the document, there's a lot of questions, but you can also just put in an overall set of comments. They will be looked at. And I think it's important that in the next couple of weeks that's left before the consultation closes, that community organizations across the city take this opportunity to make their voice heard and hopefully to result in a stronger final product, because this remains a draft NPF4. Let's hope that we can see some of these gaps closed and a document produced later this year that Scotland and its communities can be proud of, can lead us into the next decade. Thank you very much.
That's great. Thank you very much, Cliff. And of course, we would encourage individuals to submit kind of comments either through the pro forma kind of form they have, or as Cliff has said, through general comments kind of sent into them. Inevitably, although it's a high-level strategy, a high-level framework, is the implications of it for individual decision-making, decisions on planning applications being made will be direct. So it is important for people to take an interest in it, and we encourage you to kind of do so. So I'd just like to say, for those of you who've kind of watched this, thank you very much. Thanks to Cliff, Andrew, and kind of James for their kind of thoughts on it. Hopefully this has helped stimulate some thinking and encourage people to submit comments, which is part of the purpose of it. The Cockburn will be finalising its comments kind of shortly and be posting those up on our kind of website for everyone to see as well. So have a look at our kind of website in due course. And I did flag the Civic Forum meeting at the 1st of March, which is on the Cockburn Association's YouTube channel, to see a presentation to find a little bit more detail. So it just falls me to thank you very much, and let's make things better. Thank you.